Patricia Johnson arrived at Gate 41 with barely 15 minutes to spare, her mind already rehearsing the many times she had been forced to prove herself in spaces that never seemed built for her. As she strode across the polished tiles in her custom-tailored storm gray pantsuit and perfectly sensible heels, she exuded a calm assurance that belied the bitter memory of past humiliations. Yet this day was poised to mark a turning point not just for her, but for an entire industry that had long reveled in quiet discrimination. At first, the air of routine boarding offered little hint that what was to come would soon shatter the false veneer of order on that flight. Inside the bustling terminal, while mostly white, mostly male passengers moved briskly with little challenge or interruption, Patricia's presence was immediately scrutinized. As she approached the first-class boarding lane, her digital pass was scanned by a young red-hailed agent clad in a delta pin oversized on her blazer. With a tone that suddenly shifted from cordial to condescending, the agent asked, "Can I scan that again, please?" Patricia offered a polite nod and complied, knowing full well that silence was her strongest ally. As the scanner beeped green, the agent's eyes darted nervously from the screen back to Patricia's face, a subtle yet scorching reminder that the prejudice simmering beneath the surface was far from eradicated. With barely any explanation, Patricia was ushered aside by a gate attendant, whose disingenuous smile evaporated as soon as she realized the gravity of the situation. The attendant's casual dismissal of a highly qualified passenger on the basis of mere appearance had already set the stage for something far more explosive than an administrative oversight. It was a blatant act of racial profiling that rendered Patricia, an accomplished professional with accolades for breaking invisible barriers, into an undeserving target of humiliation. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the weight of each disparaging glance and whispered comment seemed to multiply, each one echoing the same cruel message. She did not belong in this space, no matter how rightfully she had earned her seat. Once on board, the cool, filtered air carried with it the sterile scent of disinfectant and a faint aroma of leather upholstery, a mixture that only highlighted the stark contrast between those deemed worthy of luxury and Patricia, who was treated as an anomaly. When she moved toward her assigned seat in first class, every detail of her careful preparation was met with thinly veiled hostility. A flight attendant, whose impeccably pulled back, platinum blonde hair and precisely measured politeness masked a well-practiced prejudice, approached her. "Good evening, ma'am," the attendant said, her tone devoid of warmth as she scanned Patricia's belongings. "Would you mind stepping back for just a moment? I need to verify something." Patricia's calm inquiry about any issue was met with a dubious inspection of her cherished caramel travel bag, an heirloom bearing the history and hardships of her family, passed down from her grandmother who had overcome countless obstacles during her journey to America in 1961. The attendant's insistence that the bag did not align with the standard profile for first class was not just an administrative hiccup, it was a jab at Patricia's very identity, a reminder that she was perpetually viewed as a misfit in spaces that should be hers by right. "This bag is within regulation size, weight, and contents," Patricia stated evenly, her voice betraying nothing of the surge of indignation beneath. It was cleared at security without issue, yet the attendant's cold retort that appearances could be misleading reverberated ominously in the confined space of the cabin. This encounter was but one of many microaggressions that had punctuated Patricia's journey on the flight. Moments later, she found herself at the mercy of a uniformed flight operations agent whose stiff demeanor and clipped precision were as much a part of the airline's fabric as the polished seats themselves. "Ms. Johnson," he said formally when addressing her, his voice tightening with rehearsed authority as he noted a so-called maintenance issue with her seat. "There appears to be a maintenance note on your seat. Specifically, the reclining mechanism isn't functioning properly. We're going to need to reseat you." Patricia's brow arched, her mind racing through countless instances where protocols had been manipulated to degrade her without a trace of empathy. "I just sat down. It appears to be working just fine," she replied coolly. Yet the agent, whose name tag reporter, offered only a rehearsed apology and insisted on relocating her to another seat in a transitional section between first class and premium economy, a section that, in any normal circumstance, would never have been suggested for her. As Patricia watched other passengers remain undisturbed in their assigned seats, she realized that this reseating was no random administrative adjustment. It was a calculated act to strip her of the dignity and comfort she had rightfully earned. The final blow came when Patricia discovered that her original seat, 1A, had been reassigned to a white woman who had boarded after her, now casually sipping champagne as if the injustice were a trivial matter. "Name one, besides me," Patricia demanded sharply, when Porter casually insisted that several passengers had been reseated for balance. His faltering response only fueled her growing conviction that this was not about safety or balance at all. It was a deliberate and targeted effort to demote her because of who she was. The tension in the cabin became palpable, every hushed whisper and sidelong glance turning into evidence of an ugly truth. This was more than just a procedural error. It was a display of deeply entrenched racism, a system of bias that had long been hidden behind the guise of operational protocol. As Patricia reluctantly moved into the transitional seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that every step was witnessed by a silent jury of passengers complicit in this injustice through their indifference. Her fingers, so used to deftly maneuvering through boardrooms and public appearances, now trembled slightly with suppressed anger and sorrow. Each mundane act, from securing her briefcase under the seat to fastening her belt, became a ritual of defiance against an institution that had tried to erase her presence. Within her mind, an intricate plan was already formulating, a plan that would not only expose this raw, ugly prejudice, but would also serve as a rallying cry for justice that few could ignore. In that fraught moment, Patricia's sense of isolation deepened. The very system designed to ensure safety and comfort instead became the instrument of her degradation. It was not merely a matter of a misplaced seat or an inconvenient policy. It was a series of deliberate attacks that had stripped her of respect and dignity at every turn. Yet even as she filed away these occurrences in her mental ledger, she felt an unmistakable stirring of resolve. Every slight, every cold dismissal only fanned the flames of a deep-seated determination to retaliate in a manner both grand and unmistakably just. A retaliation that would expose not only the individual malice of a few, but the systemic rot that allowed such discrimination to persist, unchecked. Over the course of that flight, Patricia would transform from a quietly humiliated passenger into a force of retribution, whose ultimate response would be as resounding as it was cathartic. With every incident meticulously recorded on her tablet, every policy failure and every instance of racial prejudice, she was arming herself with the evidence needed to bring down an industry that had long celebrated a veneer of fairness while quietly allowing bias to flourish. Even as Porter's feigned adherence to procedure failed to mask the simmering anger that now erupted from her with quiet intensity, Patricia's mind was already drafting the blueprint for her public response. A response so powerful that it would send shockwaves through boardrooms and courtrooms alike, demanding accountability in the most spectacular way imaginable. For decades, passengers like Patricia had been sidelined not only by outdated policies but by an unyielding system of prejudice that silently measured worth by the color of one's skin rather than the strength of one's character. Tonight, as the flight roared into the skies, she would harness that accumulated injustice and convert it into a declaration of justice. No longer would her talents be minimized and her very existence questioned. No longer would the quiet humiliation she endured be dismissed with a rehearsed smile and a hurried apology. Tonight, Patricia's retaliation would be a clarion call for change, a dramatic, unapologetic surge against the entrenched inequities that had long defined her experience. In that moment, as she glanced toward the woman now unjustly occupying her seat and felt the skeptical eyes of indifferent bystanders burn into her, Patricia knew that the time for meek acceptance was over. The raw injustice inflicted upon her was about to be met with an equally formidable display of resilience and retribution that would leave even the most hardened critics in stunned silence. Her plan was intricate and bold, a narrative of vengeance that would pierce the veil of accepted discrimination and demand that every rule, every protocol, and every biased decision be laid bare for all to see. And with that, as the engines of the plane thundered beneath her feet and the horizon beckoned with the promise of a new dawn, Patricia Johnson, no longer merely a victim of prejudice but a harbinger of righteous retaliation, set forth to redefine what it meant to claim dignity, to insist on justice, and to triumph in the face of relentless adversity. Patricia Johnson sat in the downtrodden transitional seat that the airline had so deliberately forced upon her, her heart heavy but her expression resolute. In that cramped space, which was hardly fit for a person of her dignity and experience, Patricia felt the weight of every slight and every cold, unspoken judgment. She had been patient and observant all throughout the flight, gathering every detail of the injustice, every instance of blatant and subtle discrimination. Even before she had taken her downgraded seat, Patricia had been collecting evidence like a witness preparing testimony for a long overdue reckoning. Now, as she sat alone and confined while the plane soared above the clouds, she steeled herself for the final act in a drama of prejudice that was about to reach its boiling point. It all began almost imperceptibly. Patricia had barely adjusted to her new surroundings when a loud voice cut through the murmur of settling passengers. A balding man in his late 50s, dressed in a navy blazer with a pocket square that screamed forced sophistication, pointed a crooked finger at her as if to mark her as the intruder in this clearly demarcated space. His face flushed with a mix of arrogance and assumption. He barked, "Excuse me, you are in the wrong seat." His tone carried a certainty that left no room for debate, as if he had been bestowed with the absolute authority to judge who belonged and who did not on that flight. Patricia turned slowly to face him, maintaining her composure and dignity despite the obvious provocation. With her gaze steady and voice calm yet undeniably firm, she replied, "I was assigned this seat. I can show you my boarding pass." As she produced a document on her phone, the man squinted at her as though he were encountering a puzzle he had no hope of solving. "Really? That seems unlikely," he scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. After a moment of haughty silence, he let out a laugh meant to diminish her presence and sank back into his seat, expecting the surrounding passengers to join him in his derisive judgment. Yet, while the silence that followed echoed like the roar of disapproval, not one soul stepped forward to defend Patricia from the injustice. Shortly after that exchange, Patricia turned her attention back toward the aisle and exhaled slowly through her nose. It was a subtle release, not of anger, but of the pressure that threatened to overwhelm her. Only 10 minutes later, as the last few passengers boarded and the crew began final preparations, a young flight attendant with a bright smile and a seemingly rehearsed cheerfulness approached her. "Hi there, I just want to welcome you aboard and introduce myself. I am Erica," the attendant said in a tone that was overly sweet, as if she were reading from a script of forced politeness rather than speaking from genuine regard. Patricia nodded politely, replying simply, "Thank you." Erica's eyes then drifted to Patricia's lap, where she was flipping through presentation slides on her tablet, a collection of images and data that chronicled her groundbreaking work as a biomedical researcher. "Oh, you work in tech or something?" Erica asked, her tone light and almost oblivious to the gravity of the work displayed before her. Patricia paused on a slide featuring genomic data models and replied evenly, "I lead a translational research lab at UCSF." For a moment there was a pause filled with unspoken disbelief before Erica blinked, forced a laugh that did not reach her eyes, and continued, "Wow, that is impressive. You mean like hands-on lab work with test tubes and microscopes?" Patricia's smile was tight, edged with the sting of condescension as she corrected her. "More like NIH grant submissions, complex computational modeling, and leading a team. I teach and publish as well." Erica's smile faltered for a brief second before bouncing back into place. "Well, that is cool. I will be around if you need anything," she said before moving away, leaving Patricia standing in the aisle with a sense of isolation that grew heavier with each passing moment. Across the aisle, Patricia knew that the man from earlier had not missed the exchange. His snide laugh had been barely audible, yet it resonated with the same disdainful certainty of his earlier remark. Patricia returned her attention to her tablet, but the warmth that usually accompanied her work had long since been leached away by the sting of humiliation. The real insult was not merely the cruel words or the dismissive tone. It was the ease with which her talent and presence were reduced to a stereotype that had been force-fed to her by everyone on board without a second thought. It was familiar, painfully so, like the mispronunciation of her name in conference rooms, or the constant need to assert her rightful place in a world that seemed determined to overlook her achievements. Resolute not to let these incidents fade into the background as mere annoyances, Patricia began typing in her notes app, meticulously documenting every detail. The tone of Erica's voice, the exact phrasing of the mockery, even the faint sound of the man's derisive laughter. She had learned long ago that subtle prejudice could be as damaging as overt cruelty, its impact no less profound because of its insidious nature. Every slight, every smirk, every whispered comment contributed to a growing dossier of injustice that she was determined to use as ammunition in a battle for fairness. She knew all too well that intent was irrelevant. It was the cumulative impact of these microaggressions that ultimately mattered. The cabin of the plane became an arena where every glance, every gesture was a silent vote on who belonged and who was deemed an outsider. A vote in which she had always lost. As the plane began its ascent and the final boarding announcement was played, the quiet hum of engines mixing with the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats, Patricia leaned back in her restrictive chair, forcing herself to appear calm on the surface while a storm raged beneath. She glanced down at the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist, its engraved coordinates a reminder of where she had come from, and of the sacrifices made by the strong women in her family. Every woman in her lineage had endured hardships and discrimination, and she was determined that this legacy of endurance and strength would not be tarnished by the cruelty of those who believed they could diminish her worth. At 30,000 feet in the air, before the long flight could settle into any semblance of routine, another ripple of insult slithered its way down the aisle, this time under the guise of guest comfort. Just as the plane had been cruising, a tall, brunette flight attendant with a posture suggesting both deference and discomfort approached Patricia's row once more. "Excuse me, Ms. Brooks," he said gently, though there was an edge to his voice that betrayed a rehearsed script. "We have received a passenger request regarding seating." His words were formal, almost clinical, as if Patricia's discomfort were a minor disturbance that could be easily addressed with a simple adjustment. Patricia lifted her eyes from her tablet and asked evenly, "What kind of request?" After a brief pause and a cleared throat, the attendant explained, "The gentleman in seat 6A just across the aisle has reported feeling anxious due to the proximity. He has requested some space." Patricia turned her head slightly, enough to catch a glimpse of the man in question, a heavy-set white gentleman in a pale gray sweater vest, who had spent most of the flight quietly sipping bourbon and watching her with a disapproving squint. His discomfort, now proclaimed loud enough for all to hear, seemed to be the sole justification for further disrupting her already troubled journey. The attendant, with a weak smile and measured words, offered a solution. "We would like to offer you another seat just temporarily to accommodate this request. We are trying to maintain a comfortable environment for all premium guests." For a long moment, Patricia said nothing. She let the silence settle, filling the space with an unspoken challenge. Finally, she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel, "Has anyone else been asked to move?" The man's hesitation confirmed what she already suspected. A pattern of arbitrary decisions designed to isolate her further. "No, ma'am," the attendant replied at last, his words laden with the implication that her discomfort was unique, her existence an anomaly that needed to be corrected. So one person claims he is uncomfortable and the solution is to relocate me? I booked my seat, I paid full fare, and I have been relocated once already, Patricia said slowly, her tone growing firmer. Unless this plane is on the verge of breaking apart, or that gentleman is experiencing a life-threatening emergency, I suggest you tell him that his anxiety is not my responsibility. The attendant's face flushed with embarrassment as he nodded quickly, apologizing in a manner that acknowledged both the absurdity of the situation and his own powerlessness to alter it. Without another word he left, and Patricia returned to her notes, her jaw clenched and her chest tight with the sting of being treated as if she were less than a person. As time passed and the dinner service began, the cabin filled with the rich aroma of roasted chicken and the decadent scent of truffle butter. The soft clink of cutlery on crisp linen filled the air, yet Patricia's tray remained untouched and folded neatly in her lap. No one came to ask her preference or offer her a menu. It was as if, in the midst of all the tumult and noise, she had become invisible. She pressed the call button once, and when nothing happened, she pressed it a second time, and still, there was no response. On the third try, the light above her blinked once before shutting off entirely, a small yet clear indication of the systematic neglect she was facing. Around her, other passengers enjoyed their meals and dessert. Conversations flowed, laughter erupted, and even the couple who had boarded at the last minute had already moved on to dessert. Patricia was not being served. She was being deliberately ignored. Determined not to let this dehumanizing treatment pass without a response, Patricia rose from her seat and walked purposefully toward the galley. She stopped just outside the curtain, her posture proud and her voice steady as she called out, "Excuse me." A flight attendant, one she had not yet encountered, peeked out with a puzzled expression. "Yes?" the attendant asked timidly. "I have not been served," Patricia stated clearly. "Could someone please inform me when meals are being distributed to my row?" The attendant looked at her boarding pass, checked the list, and then said with apparent confusion, "What is your seat number?" "It is 6E, Patricia replied, her tone firm. The attendant's face fell as he mumbled, "That cannot be right. You are not on my list." Patricia's eyes narrowed as she repeated, "Then your list is wrong. There must be a system error," quickly the attendant offered. "Let me get you something now." But Patricia's voice grew resolute. "No, I want you to go back and confirm why I was left off in the first place." In that moment it was clear that she had already endured one relocation for someone else's comfort, and she was not about to be erased once more. Her declaration, calm yet laden with righteous indignation, reverberated softly in the narrow space of the galley. The attendant swallowed hard and disappeared into the back, leaving Patricia alone with her mounting collection of injustices. Moments later, a different crew member returned with a full tray, her expression sheepish and apologetic. "Sorry for the confusion," the attendant mumbled. Patricia accepted the meal without a word of thanks, her silence speaking volumes about the cumulative weight of every slight she had suffered. As she ate slowly and deliberately, savoring each bite as if it were a small act of rebellion, her attention was caught by the announcement over the intercom. Name was mispronounced. Tina Brooks was called out and then quickly dismissed without any correction. There was no redress, no second chance, no acknowledgement of the error. It was another example of how she was minimized, reduced to an afterthought, in a system that was determined to ignore her very presence. When dessert was finally served, the injustice continued unabated. The attendant skipped an entire row, and Patricia, instead of speaking up, watched in painful silence. Each moment was a reminder of how exclusion could manifest itself, not only in overt hostility, but in the deliberate withdrawal of courtesy. It was a calculated act of erasure, a cold neglect that spoke of a deeper malaise, one that measured a person's worth by skin color rather than ability, one that decided that some lives were less deserving of kindness. After the trays were cleared, Patricia remained seated, a quiet storm building within her. The air in the cabin had shifted, growing denser with the weight of silent judgment. Every passing glance, every lingering look was a vote cast on who was worthy of comfort and who was not. And as she sat there, she continued to document everything on her tablet, adding a new, bold note in her log. Phase 3. Psychological pressure. Isolation by omission. Undermining presence through the withdrawal of basic human courtesy. Each item on her list was a building block for a future reckoning. A reckoning that would demand accountability from an industry that prided itself on efficiency while covertly policing who was allowed to belong. Patricia's careful record of every microaggression, every unreturned call button press, every mispronunciation of her name was not merely an expression of her own pain, but a declaration that no injustice, no matter how subtle, would go unanswered. She knew that the cumulative impact of these offenses was profound, and that they were all connected to a system that had long marginalized her and countless others like her. In the ensuing minutes, as the cabin began to settle into an uneasy quiet after the meal service, Patricia felt the full measure of her isolation. It was not just that she had been relocated or denied service. It was that she had been rendered invisible by design. The indifference of the crew, the casual cruelty of the passengers, and the systemic bias were all part of a larger pattern of discrimination that had defined her life. Yet even in the midst of this calculated erasure, Patricia felt a rising determination. The injustice she had endured was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much larger and more pervasive inequality that had plagued society for far too long. And now, 30,000 feet above the ground, she was ready to turn her personal pain into a clarion call for change. As the flight continued, Patricia's mind worked through strategies and plans. Every moment of humiliation was recorded, every microaggression noted for future use. She envisioned a public outcry, a dramatic unraveling of the airline's long-held practices of discrimination, and a counterstrike so meticulously planned that it would shock the very foundations of an industry built on superficial resolve hardened into a promise. She would no longer be a silent victim. With every unjust act, she was arming herself with evidence, preparing to unleash a response that would be as grand as it was cathartic. A response that would force both the airline and the wider public to confront the stark realities of institutional racism. Throughout the remainder of the flight, Patricia maintained her calm exterior, her face a mask of polite composure while her heart pounded with an inner fury. Each time a flight attendant passed by without a word, each time a passenger's indifferent gaze reminded her of her enforced invisibility, she silently vowed that this flight would mark the beginning of a significant upheaval. In a society that prided itself on equality and fairness, the blatant injustice she had suffered was an affront that could no longer be tolerated. Patricia was gathering every detail, every whisper of bias to form a testimonial that would soon echo far beyond the confines of that aircraft cabin. Eventually, as the flight neared its destination, the atmosphere remained heavy with the residue of all that had transpired. The lights dimmed once more, and the soft mechanical hum of the sealed door signaled the end of the service period. Patricia leaned back in her downgraded seat, her expression still unreadable on the surface, but inside, the storm of indignation and resolve was raging unchecked. She glanced around at the silent witnesses. Passengers who had either chosen complicity or were simply too overwhelmed by a system of prejudice to speak out. Their quiet acceptance of the injustice only bolstered her determination to expose every ounce of cruelty that had been inflicted on her. In that quiet darkness, Patricia's thoughts turned to the future. A future where every documented slight and every meticulously logged detail would become a rallying point for change. She pictured press conferences and legal battles, social media uproars and public inquiries, all set into motion by a woman who refused to be diminished by the stifling weight of discrimination. The transformation from victim to avenger was already underway in her mind. Every moment of indignity she had experienced was now fuel for a righteous fire that would erupt into a dramatic, uncompromising demand for justice. For Patricia Johnson, this flight was more than just an episode of personal humiliation. It was the catalyst for something far greater, a turning point where the scales of justice would finally begin to tip in favor of those who had been systematically oppressed. The journey she had endured, marked by deliberate isolation and calculated neglect, was now a testament to the resilience and unyielding strength of a woman who had weathered decades of bias and inequity. With every recorded instance of prejudice, she was preparing to dismantle a system that measured human worth by superficial appearances rather than merit and character. As the plane began its final descent and the cabin lights brightened in preparation for landing, Patricia closed her tablet and allowed herself a brief, defiant smile. A smile not of contentment, but of fierce anticipation. She knew that as soon as she stepped off that flight, her story would ignite a spark among thousands of others who had suffered similar indignities. In that moment, a quiet promise resonated within her. No longer would she be a nameless victim of subtle cruelty. No longer would her pain be hidden in the margins of polite society. Instead, Patricia Johnson would rise, triumphant and unapologetic, to reclaim her dignity and force the world to confront the ugly truth of systemic racism. And so, as the aircraft touched down on American soil and the doors began to slide open, Patricia Johnson gathered her belongings, her resolve unshaken by the physical confines of a cramped seat and a flawed system. With every step toward the terminal, she carried with her not just the memories of personal pain, but the blazing determination to set in motion a wave of change that would resonate far beyond the sterile walls of that airplane. This was her moment to transform every act of neglect into a resounding declaration of empowerment. A declaration that would leave onlookers, critics, and institutional cynics alike utterly astounded. Her heart, still pounding with a mixture of sorrow and strength, beat in unison with the promise of a new dawn. As the passengers around her hurried off to reclaim their own normalcy, Patricia walked with a measured pace that belied the storm inside. Every calculated step, every measured glance would soon become evidence in the fight against the prejudice that had long threatened to silence not just her, but the voices of all those who had ever been marginalized. The journey had been long and agonizing, but now, with every injustice recorded and every slight remembered, Patricia Johnson was ready to launch her dramatic and cathartic rebuttal. A retaliation so grand that it would leave the perpetrators and enablers of such discrimination utterly dumbfounded and force the world to listen. In that defining moment at the airplane terminal, the legacy of suffering, endurance, and quiet defiance that had shaped her life was poised to erupt into a blaze of righteous retribution. Patricia knew that the coming days, weeks, and months would be filled with struggles and battles, both in courtrooms and in the public arena. But she was no longer willing to accept the status quo. Instead, she was prepared to fight with the relentless force of all the injustices she had borne, determined to transform her personal pain into a shining beacon of hope and change for every marginalized soul. The flight had been a microcosm of a larger, more devastating reality. A reality in which the very systems designed to protect dignity and fairness were the ones that trampled it in the name of efficiency and outdated notions of superiority. Patricia Johnson's journey that day became a symbol of defiance, a rallying cry against the subtle yet pervasive cruelty that had haunted her every step. With every note recorded, every observation made, she was not just enduring but meticulously planning her counterstrike. A counterstrike that promised to dismantle the layers of prejudice with a power both unexpected and utterly magnificent. As the terminal lights shone brightly on the polished floor, and as the chatter of departing passengers filled the air, Patricia Johnson walked with her head held high. It was not just another arrival, it was the beginning of an uprising. A bold, resounding declaration that in the face of relentless cruelty and systematic injustice, she would no longer be silenced or diminished. Her story, painted in bold strokes of resilience and righteous fury, was ready to be told. And it was a story that would leave everyone who heard it utterly, profoundly moved. With each step, every measured stride across the terminal, Patricia's resolve grew stronger. She knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, that the forces of discrimination were deeply entrenched in every corner of society. But she also knew that her determination, her meticulously gathered evidence, and her unwavering belief in justice were the sparks that could ignite a revolution of equality. And so, as she passed through the sliding doors of the terminal, Patricia Johnson carried with her a promise. A promise to expose the malignancy of a system that had marginalized her for far too long, and to deliver a retribution so magnificent that it would force the entire industry and society to confront its deeply buried inequities. In that powerful moment, Patricia was not merely a victim of systemic bias. She was the architect of a dramatic comeback, a living testament to the strength and resilience of those who had suffered in silence for decades. The injustice she had endured would soon transform into a clarion call for accountability and change, and for every other soul who had been rendered invisible by a system steeped in discrimination, Patricia's story would shine as a beacon of hope, a rallying cry for justice that would resonate long after the flight had ended, long after the doors had closed behind her. Thus, as the day gave way to a twilight painted in the warm hues of redemption and resolve, Patricia Johnson stepped forward into a future where every recorded slight would be used to build a legacy of courage and transformation. Her journey was just beginning, and in that moment her quiet determination promised that no injustice, no matter how deeply ingrained, could ever silence her, nor diminish the indomitable spirit of those determined to reclaim their rightful place in the world. Johnson sat rigidly in the cramped, downgraded seat that the airline had so deliberately forced upon her, her eyes fixed on the unfolding drama around her. The row of seats was a cacophony of silent contempt and carefully measured indifference. Across the aisle, a man casually unfolded a large newspaper, as if he were used to commanding every inch of the space he occupied. The crisp snap of the pages momentarily caught her attention, but what truly made her pulse quicken was the bold headlines staring her in the face. First class is no longer what it used to be. Time to rethink passenger standards. The letters were loud, unapologetic, and carried a venomous message that seemed tailor-made for someone like her, even though no one had explicitly said so. Patricia did not flinch or offer any sign of acknowledgement. Instead, her steady gaze slowly devoured each word, as if imprinting the injustice into her memory. She recorded the headline along with its timestamp on her tablet, meticulously cross-referencing it with the seat number of the man who thought he had the authority to send such a message. Every detail was logged with the precision of a seasoned archivist of injustice, for she knew that each act of discrimination was a building block for her inevitable rebuttal. Minutes later, the uneasy silence of the cabin was shattered by a small but symbolic incident that further underscored the systemic bias she was subjected to. A young boy, no older than 6, with wild curly hair and an innocent demeanor, was sipping orange juice through a flimsy paper straw when suddenly he jerked his arm. The entire cup of juice cascaded across the narrow aisle like an uncontrolled waterfall, the vibrant liquid splattering and drenching the hem of Patricia's crisp, tailored slacks. The boy's wide eyes filled with shock, and his mother, whose face flushed with mortification, quickly leaned over the adjacent seat, her voice trembling as she apologized. "I am so sorry." There was no urgency in her tone, just the hollow echo of routine embarrassment. Patricia, ever dignified yet burning with a quiet fury, nodded politely and brushed off her leg with the edge of a napkin from her tray. No sooner had the gesture been completed than a flight attendant, Erica, swept in with efficiency that bordered on mechanical. Without hesitation, Erica turned to the mother and handed her a thick white towel, saying in an overly sweet tone, "Here you go, ma'am. Let me know if you need more." The mother accepted the towel with a grateful nod and began to dab at the spilled liquid, while Patricia, with measured politeness, extended her hand and asked, "Could I have one as well?" Erica's eyes flicked first to Patricia's face, then to the damp spot on her slacks, as if weighing her worthiness. "Oh," she said after a moment, "do you have a personal towel or napkin on hand?" Patricia's voice remained even as she replied, "No, I assumed that cabin service would include this for all passengers." The flight attendant hesitated briefly, then shrugged as if to say there was nothing more she could do. "We're short right now, but I'll see what I can find," Erica mumbled before turning and walking away, leaving Patricia alone with the lingering scent of stale orange juice on her clothes. The young boy, curious and oblivious to the storm of condescension his spill had triggered, peeked over his seat back, his eyes searching hers for an answer she was not inclined to give. The mother, however, seemed to have removed herself from the situation without a backward glance. It was not the juice itself that stung Patricia, but the message embedded in the entire occurrence. The silent declaration that someone like her was presumed to be better prepared to clean up her own mess, as though she were inherently less deserving of assistance. That was the invisible algorithm at work, a system that decided whose comfort took priority and whose did not. It was an algorithm that had been perfected over decades of subtle, insidious bias, and Patricia, with all the calm determination of a seasoned warrior, reached for her phone and resumed her diligent note-taking. She began to type a new section, titling it Post-Service Biased Behaviors, Nonverbal Dismissal Patterns, Response Lag Tied to Passenger Profile. Each keystroke was a protest, a building block for the case she was constructing, a case that would one day expose the cruelty of systemic neglect. As the cabin lights dimmed in preparation for a period of rest, pillows and blankets were methodically distributed row by row. Yet Patricia's seat remained conspicuously cold and neglected. She watched with a mix of resignation and simmering anger as Erica and another attendant passed by her row with neatly folded blankets, deliberately bypassing her without even the slightest acknowledgement. This was no accident, but a choreographed act of exclusion, the final blow to her already battered sense of dignity. Patricia sat upright, eyes narrowed against the chill in the cabin, a chill that felt far worse than any drop in temperature. It was the bitter cold of being purposely ignored. By now, she had ceased expecting even the most basic decency from the crew. Yet she continued to remember, record, and prepare. Every gesture, every word, and every silence was recorded in her notes as evidence that would later speak for her. Even as the flight proceeded and the passengers surrendered to the lull of sleep or idle chatter, she remained a living testament to the enduring weight of prejudice. The quiet contempt that had cloaked her during the earlier hours now hardened into an unyielding resolve. The atmosphere in the cabin was no longer just one of physical coolness, but of calculated emotional distance. A space where every exchanged glance silently weighed her worth. Then, as if the slow churning of time had conspired to mark the apex of the day's indignities, a sudden commotion erupted near the front of the aircraft. A sharp gasp, followed by the unmistakable clatter of a glass shattering on the floor, cut through the subdued murmur of passengers. Heads turned and eyes widened in alarm as an elderly man, perhaps in his mid-70s, slumped suddenly in his seat. His skin turned ashen, and his mouth hung slack in a manner that sent a chill far deeper than the cool air circulating in the cabin. A woman sitting beside him shrieked, "He is not breathing right," and frantically waved her hands, summoning the attention of anyone who could help. Patricia's senses snapped into high alert as she immediately rose from her seat, her fatigue melting away in the face of urgent responsibility. "I am certified for in-flight emergency response," she announced clearly, stepping into the aisle with purpose and authority. "I am FAA licensed, and I currently head clinical simulation at UCSF." Her words rang out, steady and self-assured, as she hurried toward the unconscious man. But before Patricia could reach him, a flight attendant, one whom she had not encountered earlier, stepped forward and blocked her path with arms outstretched. "Thank you, but please return to your seat," the attendant said briskly, his voice cold and devoid of any recognition of her credentials. "We need a professional to handle this." Patricia's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "I am a professional," she countered, her tone calm yet laced with an undeniable edge. "I have handled over 50 in-air medical emergencies and have trained hundreds of paramedics in crisis protocol." The attendant's response was mechanical, as though following a script, rather than engaging with a person who clearly possessed the necessary expertise. "We understand, but our crew is trained for these situations," he said, before turning away to confer with another crew member. In that charged moment, another voice floated from the row next to the man who had collapsed. A nearby passenger shouted, "Somebody help him!" Yet no one else was willing to step forward, and the silence that fell was suffocating. Patricia clenched her fists, her heart pounding, not out of egotism but out of the raw, bitter realization that her qualifications were being dismissed purely based on their source. For her, this was no isolated incident, but a clear, public declaration that her expertise was deemed insufficient by a system that clung to archaic biases. The call for a doctor rang over the intercom, echoing down the narrow aisle. "Is there a licensed medical doctor on board? Please press your call button immediately," the attendant pleaded, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that Patricia had just been publicly and unjustly labeled unqualified. Calmly, she raised her hand again, determined to reclaim her dignity. "I already said I am qualified," she stated firmly. Before she could elaborate further, Erica reappeared, this time visibly flustered and with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "Are you a physician?" she asked flatly, the tone of her inquiry dripping with condescension. "I am a trauma-certified PhD in biomedical emergency care with FA flight emergency clearance," Patricia replied in a steady, unwavering voice. "I hold 2 advanced certifications in airborne medical intervention, and I train residents regularly." Erica paused, clearly processing her words, but her skepticism was palpable. "So you're not an MD?" she interjected, as if trying to reduce the extensive qualifications to a single, narrow criteria. "Correct," Patricia answered calmly. "But I am more than capable of handling this situation safely and effectively." Before another word could be exchanged, a man from business class, tall, bald, and seemingly in his 40s, stepped forward. He quietly offered, "I am a general practitioner," and the crew immediately swarmed him, their focus shifting away from Patricia as if her expertise were suddenly irrelevant. As the man approached the patient, Patricia watched in silence, her heart burning, not because of bruised pride, but because she knew that the man's tentative handling of the emergency could put the man's life at greater risk. He hesitated, checking the pulse with trembling hands, his voice wavering under the pressure. It was painfully evident that he was out of his depth in this high-stakes situation, and Patricia felt a surge of anger at the thought that her qualifications had been dismissed because of prejudiced assumptions about who was worthy of trust. It took only 30 seconds for Patricia to realize that the man from business class was not going to suffice. Even though the older gentleman's condition began to improve slightly, it was clear that his recovery was owed more to the slow, inevitable effect of time and oxygen than to any competent intervention. The tension in the cabin gradually diffused into an embarrassed silence, punctuated by the occasional whispered comment. Erica, now attempting damage control, walked back down the aisle and paused beside Patricia's row. "Thank you for offering," she said in a strained tone. "But protocol does not include insulting licensed responders mid-flight." Patricia cut in sharply. "It does not include letting personal bias override competence." Erica did not reply and hurried away, leaving behind an atmosphere heavy with unspoken reproach. The other passengers watched silently, their expressions a mix of discomfort and reluctant acknowledgement, as if they too were coming to terms with the limitations of the system they silently endorsed. When the commotion had finally died down, Patricia returned to her seat with trembling fingers that picked up her tablet. Each recorded instance, each moment of humiliation, and every dismissive glance were now carefully noted. She was not angry simply because her credentials had been doubted. She was furious because a vulnerable life had been put at risk by assumptions that treated her as an afterthought. In her notes, she added a new section: incompetence preferred over unexpected expertise, safety sacrificed for the appearance of control. Each line was etched with the ink of her resolve, a promise that the day's injustices would not be allowed to vanish without consequence. In the following minutes, a secure calm returned to the cabin as the aircraft prepared for its final descent. The lights flickered slightly, and a low murmur of mechanical static over the intercom signaled that the plane was entering its final phase. Amid the dimming glow and the soft cadence of the passengers' subdued whispers, Patricia reached into her coat pocket and tapped her smartwatch with deliberate precision. She executed a secure protocol, one that she had learned and activated months ago, hidden behind layers of federal aviation clearance and personal responsibility. What appeared to be a casual gesture was, in fact, the sending of a coded signal into the very heart of the aviation control system. Only someone with active federal aviation investigation credentials could send such a signal without attracting unwanted attention. As the seconds ticked by, Patricia resumed typing on her tablet, now in a state of quiet determination. She recorded the full chronology of the day's events, the seat reassignments, the neglect of meal service, the unreturned call buttons, the mispronunciations, and the outright dismissal of her expertise during the in-flight emergency. Every detail was meticulously documented, with timestamps and precise observations. Her notes were not just a record of grievances, they were evidence, a meticulously assembled dossier that would soon serve as the foundation of a thunderous exposé on systemic discrimination. Then came the subtle shift that signaled the tipping point. The cabin lights flickered more noticeably, and a palpable hum of static emanated from the cockpit over the intercom. A few passengers looked up in puzzled silence as the atmosphere shifted, charged with an anticipatory energy that hinted at profound change. Patricia remained still, her eyes focused on the unfolding scene ahead. Soon, deliberate footsteps approached. Not hurried, but measured, with the kind of determination that could only come from someone who had seen enough and was ready to take control. The curtain to the front cabin parted gracefully, and a man stepped out in a Navy pilot uniform adorned with silver stripes and wings. He appeared to be in his late 50s, tall and grave, with a presence that commanded respect without uttering a word. His posture was straight, and his eyes were set with a knowing seriousness that immediately contrasted with the earlier frivolity. He stopped directly in front of Patricia's row and addressed her clearly. "Ms. Johnson." His tone was even, but there was an underlying shift that suggested the balance of power was about to change. His gaze swept the cabin, as though assessing not only the physical space, but the emotional landscape of every passenger present. For a long moment, silence reigned as he studied Patricia, and then he continued, his voice calm yet carrying a weight of authority that left no room for argument. "I have been briefed on the events of this flight, and it is evident that there has been a significant breach of both protocol and common decency. The system that you have painstakingly documented, the misplaced assignments, the service denials, the disregard for your qualifications, cannot stand unchecked." The pilot's words, measured and resolute, reverberated through the cabin like a clarion call. Patricia felt an unexpected warmth mingled with her fervor as the pilot's authority underscored the truth she had lived all day. It was as if the very institution that had been complicit in her abuse was now being challenged from within. The pilot's arrival signaled the start of what would become a turning point, a dramatic reversal that promised not merely to expose the systemic bias, but to dismantle it, brick by brick, through the weight of undeniable truth and unyielding accountability. The man in the pilot's uniform spoke steadily, detailing that an investigation would be launched immediately and that each incident documented by Patricia would serve as the cornerstone of a federal inquiry. His unwavering stance was like a balm to her wounded pride, affirming that her struggles were not in vain. He explained that the signal she had sent was received by authorities with the power to convene an in-flight review committee, a committee that would scrutinize the airline's protocols from top to bottom and ensure that all discriminatory practices were eradicated. As the pilot's words resonated with the gathered passengers, Patricia felt the heavy cloak of isolation begin to lift. The inevitable tide of accountability was rising, and it was clear that her rigorous documentation and unwavering determination were about to bear fruit in the most magnificent, cathartic manner imaginable. No longer would the facade of efficiency, of gentle courtesy, conceal the deep-seated cruelty that had been inflicted upon her. Instead, her meticulously gathered evidence would serve as a fulcrum for change, empowering not just her, but every marginalized soul who had ever been disregarded in the name of protocol. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted palpably as the pilot detailed the forthcoming actions. He announced that a comprehensive review of the crew's performance was being initiated, one that would interrogate every decision, every omission, and every act of bias. His words were designed not merely to placate the immediate situation, but to serve as a resounding declaration that discrimination would no longer be tolerated, not on his watch, not in this industry, and certainly not in the lives of those whose worth could never be measured by the color of their skin or the stereotypes imposed upon them. Patricia listened intently, each word reaffirming her long-held conviction that retaliation for injustice did not have to be an explosion of anger, but could be a measured, strategic upheaval, a dramatic transformation that left onlookers in utter disbelief and compelled accountability from the highest echelons of authority. The pilot's promise was clear. Change was coming, and it would be as resounding as it was transformative. Over the next few minutes, while the pilot conferred with the crew and assured the passengers that proper procedures were now being initiated, Patricia felt her resolve solidify into a steely determination to launch her own dramatic counterstrike upon landing. Every documented slight, from the headline that had boldly targeted her to the spilled juice that marked her clothing to the dismissals of her expertise in a moment of dire crisis, was fuel for a movement that would echo well beyond the confines of this flight. Her story was not merely one of personal humiliation, but a microcosm of a broader societal failure, one that demanded accountability with the force of righteous retribution. As the plane began its final descent, the pilot's authoritative presence left the cabin awash in an atmosphere of anticipatory transformation. While many passengers exchanged relieved glances and subdued murmurs of acknowledgement, Patricia sat back in her seat with a quiet smile of vindication. The storm within her, long nurtured by years of unrelenting bias and whispered dismissals, was now tempered by the certainty that her fight was just beginning. The flight had become a crucible where every act of discrimination had been recorded and would later serve as the foundation for a sweeping, uncompromising change. A change that would be unleashed upon the airline and the industry as a whole. In that final phase before landing, Patricia's mind raced with plans and strategies. She envisioned press conferences where her meticulous notes would be presented to the world, courtrooms that would hear the damning evidence of systemic neglect, and public debates where her story would inspire others to stand up against the quiet tyranny of discrimination. Her resolve was not a solitary act of revenge, but a declaration on behalf of all those who had ever been relegated to the margins, forced to prove their worth in a system that had no respect for their inherent dignity. With the landing gear lowering and the terminal lights beginning to filter into the cabin, Patricia closed her tablet and looked up at the pilot one last time. His steady gaze met hers, a silent promise that the ordeal of the day would not end in quiet resignation, but in a boisterous demand for justice that would leave even the most callous critics utterly astonished. As the plane touched down on American soil, the monumental weight of the documented injustices transformed into a tangible, incendiary force that would soon erupt into a full-scale campaign of accountability and retribution. Patricia Johnson gathered her few belongings with deliberate care and stepped off the aircraft with her head held high. Every step she took through the terminal was measured and purposeful. It was a walk not just of a battered passenger, but of a woman on the brink of revolution, ready to expose every ounce of cruelty she had endured and to demand that the institution which had wronged her be held accountable in the most spectacular fashion. Her journey that day had been a microcosm of decades of neglect and bias, and it was now about to ignite a forceful backlash that promised to shake the very foundations of the system. In that defining moment, Patricia's heart pounded with a mixture of sorrow, rage, and unyielding resolve. She knew that the road ahead would be fraught with battles in boardrooms, courtrooms, and public discourse, but the fire of transformation burned within her. No longer would she allow her talent, her dedication, and her very existence to be diminished by prejudice and condescension. Her meticulously recorded evidence, her calm defiance in the face of repeated insults, and her unwavering courage were all parts of an unfolding epic, a story that would galvanize countless others to rise, to protest, and to reclaim their rightful place in a society that had long denied them dignity. As she passed through the sliding doors of the terminal, Patricia Johnson's quiet determination was unmistakable. The legacy of every slight, every moment of neglect, and every instance of blatant bias had coalesced into a singular promise: that she would not remain invisible, that her voice would not be silenced, and that the injustice of that day would serve as the spark to ignite a revolution of accountability. With each deliberate step toward the promise of a new dawn, she carried with her the hopes of every marginalized soul who had ever been overlooked. Her story, now fully recorded in painstaking detail, was ready to be unleashed, a dramatic, unapologetic rebuttal that would leave onlookers in stunned silence and force the world to confront the ugly truth of systemic racism. Patricia knew that this was only the beginning, that the road to true justice was long and treacherous. But she also knew that with every organized line of evidence, every recorded act of bias, and every careful observation, a movement was stirring. A movement that would soon demand reparations, reforms, and a complete overhaul of the structures that had perpetuated such discrimination for far too long. In that moment, as she walked away from the aircraft and into the bright glow of the terminal, Patricia Johnson became much more than a survivor of prejudice. She transformed into an emblem of defiance, a beacon of hope for every person who had been unjustly marginalized. Her journey was now intertwined with the promise of a future where every documented slight would become a clarion call for sweeping change. A future where those in power would finally be held accountable for the cruelty they had inflicted. And so, with the resolute steps of a seasoned fighter and the heart of someone who had weathered countless storms, Patricia Johnson set forth on her next chapter, a chapter destined to echo through corridors of power and public sentiment alike, leaving a legacy of courageous retribution that would forever stand as testimony to the fact that no injustice, however deeply ingrained, could ever silence a spirit determined to rise and reclaim its rightful dignity. Patricia Johnson looked up at the captain with steady eyes as the weight of protocol settled in the cabin. The captain nodded formally and said, "We received your signal. I've confirmed your credentials. Would you like to proceed with inspection now or upon landing?" The surrounding passengers fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. As a tremor of tension filled the air, the man with the newspaper lowered it with trembling hands, and the mother of the boy who had spilled orange juice stared in disbelief, while Erica, the flight attendant, who had just passed by with a tray of tea, dropped her voice to a whisper. "Inspection," the captain announced. "This flight is now under observational review by the Office of Civil Air Compliance. We are to maintain operational transparency and cooperate fully. Ms. Johnson holds oversight clearance under federal aviation law." Erica blinked, visibly paling as the truth of Patricia's authority sank in. Patricia rose slowly, brushing the front of her blazer smooth, and said with calm resolve, "I did not ask for this, but I've been watching everything." Meanwhile, a young man at the rear had been live-streaming the unfolding drama. His channel, known for reaction commentary, erupted with comments as viewers learned of her true identity. Whispers began to fill the cabin. One passenger murmured in amazement, "That's Dr. Patricia Johnson, the one who pulled 5 passengers from that Gulfstream crash 2 years ago. She even received the President's Medal of Freedom." Messages flooded in from phones. People recalled her TED Talk, her life-saving training, and how her methods had saved loved ones. The video clips were quickly shared and re-uploaded, cementing her reputation as an emergency expert. Patricia did not allow herself to be swayed by the sudden attention. Instead, she addressed the captain calmly. "We will begin documentation upon landing. In the meantime, please inform your crew that I will be monitoring every interaction from here on." The captain's reply, a respectful "yes ma'am, will comply," landed like thunder in the hushed cabin. Her smartwatch vibrated lightly with a push message from SkyPrime Airport Service System, confirming in bold, "Thank you, Dr. Patricia Johnson, Platinum Medical Liaison Member, 7 years of emergency flight response service." A teenage girl across the aisle caught a glimpse of the notification and whispered to her neighbor, "That's real. She's registered at the federal level." As if on cue, a young man in a white hoodie, proudly bearing the Johns Hopkins crest, stood up and said with genuine admiration, "I know you, Dr. Johnson. You were my trauma module lead last spring. Your advanced rapid response course saved my life after my motorcycle accident." His sincere tone resonated through the cabin, silencing any lingering doubts about her competency. The pilot, now accompanied by a flight supervisor, addressed the cabin once more. "Dr. Johnson, your report has been escalated. Would you like to initiate a real-time compliance audit?" Patricia accepted the provided tablet and said, "Effective immediately, I'll begin with the manifest. Pull all employee interaction data for the last 8 hours." Her voice, firm and authoritative, left no room for debate. As federal agents began boarding and reporters gathered outside, Patricia collected her digital logs and photographic evidence with measured grace. When the plane touched down, news broke across devices. A formal inquiry was served to Skylux Airlines. The Department of Health and Human Services terminated a multi-million-dollar contract, and passengers spoke out about racial profiling on Flight 386. Stepping off the aircraft with quiet dignity, Patricia Johnson turned to the waiting cameras. Looking directly at one lens, she stated softly, "Accountability is not an attack, it is a mirror." Then she walked on, leaving behind a stunned cabin and setting in motion a tidal wave of change that would echo far beyond that fateful flight. Patricia Johnson sat calmly in the downgraded seat that the airline had forced on her, her steady gaze never wavering despite the heavy weight of protocol and prejudice that now filled every corner of the cabin. Moments earlier, as she had transmitted her secure signal, the captain had acknowledged her credentials with the gravitas of a military officer. He asked politely, "We received your signal. I have confirmed your credentials. Would you like to proceed with inspection now or upon landing?" In that brief pause, the entire cabin fell into an eerie silence. Passengers stopped mid-conversation. Even the man clenching a newspaper, whose very headlines had denounced first class in a message laced with covert hostility, lowered his paper with trembling hands. Erica, the flight attendant who had earlier bypassed her with perfunctory service, could only whisper her dismay as the captain made it clear that this flight was under direct review by the Office of Civil Air Compliance. "Inspection," the captain repeated with cold precision. "This flight is now subject to full observational review, and Ms. Johnson holds oversight clearance under federal aviation law." Erica's face paled noticeably. Patricia, still poised and dignified, responded, "I did not ask for this, but I have been watching everything." Her measured tone cut through the tension and demanded respect. At the rear of the cabin, a young man had been live-streaming every moment, his camera capturing the raw reality of what was unfolding. His social media channel, known for reaction commentary, ignited with comments as viewers began to recognize her. "That is Dr. Patricia Johnson, the woman who saved 5 passengers from that Gulfstream crash 2 years ago. She even received the President's Medal of Freedom." The live stream exploded with declarations of awe, and passengers started whispering among themselves. Not long after, the captain announced that the flight was now under full audit and that every interaction would be documented. Patricia reassured him with unwavering authority. "We will begin documentation upon landing. In the meantime, please inform your crew that I will be monitoring every interaction." His respectful reply, "Yes, ma'am, we will comply," resounded like thunder throughout the cabin. As if on cue, her smartwatch vibrated, displaying a push message from the Sky Prime Airport Service System. "Thank you, Dr. Patricia Johnson, Platinum Medical Liaison Member. 7 years of emergency flight response service." The message, normally routine, now cut deep through the shame and bias that had plagued her all day. A teenage girl across the aisle caught a glimpse of the glowing notification and whispered to her neighbor, "That's real. She's registered at the federal level." Then came a pivotal moment as a young man sporting a white hoodie with the Johns Hopkins crest rose to his feet and addressed her with a mix of admiration and gratitude. "I know you, Dr. Johnson. You were my trauma module lead last spring. Your advanced rapid response course saved my life after my motorcycle accident." His voice, sincere and trembling with respect, echoed through the cabin and silenced any lingering doubts about her expertise. Patricia offered him a gentle nod, and in that silent moment the atmosphere shifted. Passengers began to look at her with newfound reverence rather than suspicion. Before long, the captain, now accompanied by a flight supervisor who had emerged from the jump seat, presented her with a tablet. "Dr. Johnson, your report has been escalated," he stated firmly. "Would you like to initiate a real-time compliance audit now?" Rising to the occasion, she replied, "Effective immediately. I will begin with the seat reassignment records and service logs for the past 8 hours." With every word, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had endured years of subtle abuse and overt discrimination, but refused to be defined by it any longer. As she tapped through the data logs, the digital evidence of every slight, the unfair service, the wrongful seat changes, the dismissive gestures, became a damning dossier not only for the airline, but for the entire system of bias that had attempted to strip her of her dignity. Outside the plane, as it touched down with a soft groan on the American tarmac, a line of government vehicles loomed into view. 2 Department of Transportation SUVs, a sedan marked with the Office of Civil Rights seal, and a discreet unmarked van carrying FAA internal compliance officers, all converged around Skylux Airlines' jet. The passengers watched in a mixture of shock and awe as federal agents boarded the aircraft. No one dared challenge Patricia's authority, not even the man who had earlier wielded his newspaper as a tool of exclusion. He simply turned his head to the window, refusing to look back. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed from one of oppressive silence and shame to the charged expectancy of impending accountability. Cameras began rolling as reporters gathered near the arrival area, their lenses capturing every moment. Headlines like "Flight Crew Rejects Help from Hero Doctor" and $2 million medical contract in jeopardy after airline humiliates national medal recipient flashed across screens nationwide. Federal agents stepped forward and questioned crew members, while passengers whispered in tones that revealed their collective guilt. It was as if the truth had been unleashed, and every act of deliberate bias was now on record for all the world to see. In the final hours of that tumultuous day, as federal agents led crew interviews and media vans lined the tarmac, Patricia Johnson's journey had come full circle. Through the live stream that had exposed unchecked racial bias, through the heartfelt confessions of former colleagues, and through the quiet sketches of a young admirer, her story had ignited a movement. It was a story that demanded accountability not just from a single airline, but from an entire system that had long devalued lives and dismissed excellence based on the color of one's skin. And as Patricia stepped forward into a new chapter, her voice resonated with the promise that change, though born of fierce adversity, would soon mirror the truth in every corner of American society. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on how silence can be transformed into a powerful call for justice, and let us know which moment touched your heart the most. Every voice matters, every act of courage counts, and together, we can build a future where true leadership looks nothing like the prejudice of the past.